2 months into her new job, Governor Laura Kelly sits down to talk about how things are going. What does she think about the chance to lower your grocery sales taxes, efforts to expand Medicaid, and the ongoing fight over school funding? We ask her all those questions and more. Hear her answers starting right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Governor Laura Kelly took the oath of office just over 2 months ago. School funding, one of the things voters chose her for. So what does she think about how long lawmakers are taking to put together a plan? This week I asked her. The Senate has approved your proposal for fixing school funding, but the House is looking at a different proposal, says it's not likely to take up your proposal at the moment, but the state has a deadline with the court. How does this posturing affect the state's ability to meet the court's deadline?
Well, I think the politically easy thing to do would be to just respond to the court's expectation, which is exactly what my bill did and what the Senate passed. That just solves the problem right there, and we can, fund our schools and get out of court. So I think that's the actually more expedient and easier thing to do than to be fighting this, because I don't know the entire contents of the House education bill at this point, but I think one thing that's in there is the elimination of the last 2 years of funding. My plan is a 4-year plan. If we eliminate those last 2 years in what we send over to the court, I think we can expect it back on our doorstep quickly. Because in 2005, when we were dealing with school finance before, we fully funded for 2 years out. Recession hit, the courts gave us a pass on that because we really didn't have the money. But then when the recession was over and we continued to cut schools, I think the court felt that, I don't know, betrayed is the right word, but they certainly couldn't trust us. And so I think if we're not clear that we plan, this is a long-range solution that we're seeking, that they will be sending that right back to us to redo.
Now, here to help me dive beneath the surface of the governor's answers, we have Adam Catland, editor of the Wellington Daily News, Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist from Friends University, and Bob Weeks from Liberty TV. Thank you all so much for joining me. Now, Dr. Fox, I noticed you taking some notes as we were listening to that. Certainly, some of the things that we've heard before. Obviously, the governor prefers her own plan, but there are some concerns about the alternative plans that are out there right now.
Well, the governor obviously prefers her own plan because this is the one that she campaigned on, and this is the one that she thinks is the most straightforward way of satisfying the state Supreme Court and moving on to the things that she really wants to address as part of her first year in office. The House plan includes some really interesting ideas, but in order to make those ideas fit together into a whole package, it's changing the numbers that were already out there, the numbers that the state Supreme Court had relied upon in making their calculations. And so even if some of the Republicans in the Senate might be, sympathetic to some of the ideas being talked about over on the House side, they seem pretty content with the idea of, let's put this to bed as soon as we can. So you have some genuine policy arguments that are taking place, but you also have, arguments about how we approach governing. Do we look upon existing problems as things that we need to resolve as effectively as possible? Or do we, want to take existing problems and, potentially complicate them in the quest for what some people think might be better solutions?
Well, she may prefer her bill, but it certainly seems like the House prefers to go a different direction. From what I'm hearing out of Topeka, even today and yesterday, they were saying, yeah, that's a good Senate bill, that's a governor's bill, and we're going to spend some more time talking about this one, really. And as we talk about this whole school funding issue, Bob, you and I have covered politicians here in Kansas for quite some time. Laura Kelly is not the first governor to run into this roadblock.
Sure. And really it's a roadblock from a couple different directions, because the Schools for Fair Funding people, that's the organization that has brought all the lawsuits, they have a different interpretation than the governor does as to what it takes to satisfy the Supreme Court. And I believe the number that Schools for Fair Funding says it's like 3 times or something like that of the governor's proposals. That's what they say they believe the court means. So she's being hit from both sides on this issue.
But keep in mind there's other educational bodies that disagree with that, like the Kansas Association of School Boards is on the governor's side. They agree with her interpretation as the best way to respond to the court's ruling.
So all this arcana of different bills and this amount or that amount, obviously Kansans want more money in their schools. They voted by a majority for Laura Kelly over Chris Kobach. But how much do they care about these details as you talk to your readers in Sumner County?
Well, they would love to see, they want to see their money well spent. They want to see bang for their buck. I mean, people in Sumner County, I mean, they've got a very high sales tax down there, and they're not very happy about that. And there's a large percentage of people who don't feel like they are getting their money's worth down there, and they're very disappointed. I mean, Sumner County went for Chris Kobach by quite a margin down there. So, they were very anti-tax, and a lot of people are griping down there, well, when's the tax increase going to kick in for Governor Kelly? And so far it has not. But, there's this, like I said, the people in Sumner County, they just would like to see their money well spent, I believe.
Well, and I think that's kind of something that most Kansans want, is they want to see their money spent
properly. They
properly.
want efficiency with their government. I mean, what happened over the last several years with Governor Brownback, things really hit bottom for a lot of people, and it just really kind of shook their faith in government.
Yeah. Well, education makes up the biggest portion of the Kansas budget, but there are other things to be considered as well. One question that's been a big deal with this year's budget, CAPERS making big payments into the pension plan and refinancing it. At this point, we're still trying to wait. We're not trying. We are waiting to see if the legislature will pass your budget, and they haven't done it exactly as you proposed. For example, SB 9 with a $115 million payment to CAPERS. That was a pretty good chunk out of money that would have gone elsewhere.
Well, that was money that actually came out of the ending balance, so it doesn't impact any of the other expenditures, because there was enough of an ending balance that we were well over the 7.5% statutorily required balance. So, and that was okay, which is why I was fine with it. I would have preferred that we did the re-amortization, but it wasn't absolutely essential to the success of the budget to do that this year. That will come back up as we go forward, because when you look at the CAPERS payments that the state would be required to make within 10 years, we're talking about $1 billion a year. We can't do that. So we will have to re-amortize and flatten out those payments in the near future.
So all of those critics out there right now that are saying, well, re-amortizing, that's just refinancing, and in the long run it's going to cost us more money, you're saying the state has no choice in the long term? Well,
it's a standard tool that states use for something like this. I mean, we've often compared it to refinancing your house. Let's say you go part-time in your work instead of full-time. Your salary goes down. You can no longer afford the payments structure that you set up before. So what do? You can go refinance your house and bring those payments down. Yes, will you be paying it out over a longer period of time? For sure you will. Will you end up paying a little more? Yes, you will. But it's how it has to work, because you don't have the money to make the payments now. And by re-amortizing now, we actually stabilize that fund and secure our retirements for our state employees and city employees far more than if we don't do it, and we get to a point where we can't afford the employer's share, we don't make it, and that's when we really start to send that system into turmoil.
Now, I've got to say, that comments she made about reamortization being a must-do, if not this year, then within the next 5 to 10 years for Kansas, kind of took me by surprise. Lots of talks with lots of different folks about that proposal. That's the first time I'd heard anyone say that. Now, Bob, I know you spend a lot of time looking at numbers. Does that jive with what you see as you look at the state numbers and the history over the last few years?
No, I was surprised to hear her say that too, because I thought that the contribution we were making this year plus the borrowing we did in the past was getting us back up to a better benchmark of funded percentage. So that came out of the blue for me.
You know, the fact that she ends that exchange, or not ends it, but as a part of the exchange with you, she talked about how, we had the money, sufficient within the budget to take care of this. It makes me wonder what, kind of thinking is taking place in regards to the reamortization. Okay, so you compare it to refinancing a house. Yes, refinancing a house is, a fairly common tool that people make use of. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a wise tool to always make use of. You've got to be considering several different issues, particularly when you're talking about a public entity like the government. You've got to be looking at revenue streams. You've got to be looking at tax receipts. And of course, in connection with SB 22, there's a lot of ambiguity right now about what exactly is going to be coming in. They have some things that they're certain of, and they knew that they were going to be able to cover things within that budget. I wonder what it was that she had in mind that made her say, well, this is going to have to happen at one point or another anyway.
Well, I think maybe part of that was the next part. We ran out of time, so I didn't run the next question in there. But the next part then was as we started to talk about the concerns about a coming recession.
Okay.
And I know a lot of her decisions, as we were talking throughout that entire interview, were based on we don't know when, but the timing is right as far as regular ups and downs go, that there's a recession out there not too far out.
And that's an additional wrinkle, and it's probably wise for the governor to be thinking in those terms, especially given the fact that, we're coming out of, a self-imposed fiscal, crisis as well.
Now, Adam, you're looking at this as a journalist, thinking about your viewers. What questions does it raise with you?
Well, you've got the CAPER system. It's got to be fixed. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's a mistake that was really made worse. I'm showing my colors here. I don't care. by the last several years of state government, it's going to take some time to dig it out. I mean, if we're looking at numbers, there's no question it has to be fixed. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take. It has to be fixed for these people to have their future be secure.
And certainly something that most would argue public servants have earned by taking a smaller paycheck.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, something else that is going on this week, the Kansas House held a surprise debate on expanding Medicaid, eventually approving the plan and sending it on to the Senate. But to get there, supporters had to go outside the traditional committee route, something the governor predicted when I spoke with her.
For me, it just seems unfathomable, not to have that access. God, I'm so happy that we're pushing for that again.
That's what Jimmy Olsen told me in January at the beginning of the legislative session. He's one of some 140,000 Kansans who make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but too little to purchase health insurance on the exchange. A majority of Kansans are consistently saying they want to expand Medicaid, and it was one of Governor Laura Kelly's priorities on the campaign trail.
I would prefer that it go through the regular committee process, debate on the floor, to my desk, but if that can't happen, there are some other strategies that can be used.
That's what the governor told me earlier this week when I asked her about the possibility of passing Medicaid expansion this year. And that's what happened Wednesday over the lunch hour.
We've discussed this for 5 years. I believe this is our chance today.
Kansas City Democrat Kathy Wolf Moore forced the issue and got enough votes to move forward with debate. Opponents say Kansas can't afford expansion and predicted a budget crunch within 5 years as health care continues to get more expensive.
I could see us starting to have to slash higher education because of that growth, that exponential growth that will come to Health and Human Services. So again, make your vote. We'll move forward. We'll pass an increase to K-12.
And supporters like those who've already lost their struggling rural hospitals say Kansas can't afford not to move forward with expansion.
What we're doing now is not working. What we're looking at is more cities looking at the same type of situation Independence has, where continuity of care has disappeared.
This was a long debate, and it took a lot of people by surprise. I had several people from Topeka texting me, so this is going on. We're debating Medicaid now. And one thing that really kind of came out of this is, as I was covering this week, is I've looked at all the different polls, and all but one of them that I have found says that between 60 and 78% of Kansans want expanded Medicaid. We had the votes in the legislature 2 years ago. It passed. It just shy, I think it was like 1 or 2 votes shy of overriding Governor Brownback's veto. We've pulled back a little bit from that. We had fewer votes this time. It was 81 last time. We only had 70 this time, but it still passed easily. It only needed like 63. So they had a few to spare. Yeah. And yet I had people calling me saying, I don't know anyone in my area. I've never talked to anybody who wants to expand Medicaid. We can't afford this. How common is it throughout the state for people really to want expanded Medicaid? Adam, let's start with you.
Well, expanding Medicaid, the hospitals, we've seen so many of these small hospitals, they're dropping like flies. We've lost how many of these so far, but places like Independence, that's a fairly still big community. The community, I'm the editor of the newspaper in Wellington, came this close to losing their hospital recently. It was only by outside intervention that they still have the hospital that they have today. And it's doing well. It's doing a lot better than it has in quite a number of years. Will expanded Medicaid help it? You bet it would. It would help a lot of these communities. There's no reason why this can't be done, except some people just have their ideological, political differences about the government coming in to help communities like this, and it shouldn't be that way. It should be a case of these people need help, and they should be able to get it.
Okay. Russell?
Okay, I mean, there's a lot that we could say about this because, the argument's been going on for a really long time. Okay, so looking at it just in terms of, how do we assess the popularity of this, and how do we look at how the state Republican Party and the state Democratic Party are responding or not responding to the voters? As you mentioned, it came up 2 years ago. There were more people that were willing to cross party lines and vote with the Democrats because, the Democrats are the ones that are really pushing this. The Republican leadership is the one that is resisting it. There were more Republicans that were willing to break 2 years ago than broke this time. The key difference, of course, is that Laura Kelly is the governor, which means that if it actually passes the House and the Senate like it did 2 years ago, it's not going to be vetoed. That's really the rub. There are people who recognize that there are voters who want Medicaid expansion, but they have, as you mentioned, some real ideological problems with that. But they also want to respond to their voters' needs. They want to respond to their voters' interests, their voters' wishes. And so they make a decision. They say, well, I'm going to step forward and I'm going to support this expansion because I'm going to try to move the conversation forward. But I'm confident that Governor Brownback is going to veto it, so I'm not really, on the line here. Now we have a Democratic governor, which means that they've really got to ask themselves how much are they willing to move on regards to their ideological priors, how much are they going to be willing to, face down local party leaders that may have been instrumental to them being elected. I still think that the polls that show a general support for Medicaid expansion are pretty reliable. But when you take those polls and you actually plug them into the decision dynamics that people in the House and the Senate are faced with, especially when you're talking about the fact that their own party leaders often are the strongest opponents to this, those popular numbers are not necessarily going to result in the same level of popular votes. I think the Senate is probably going to go ahead and support Medicaid expansion. I think it'll be very close. And I don't think it is by any means a sure thing.
Yeah. Hey, you and I were talking about that, weren't we, Bob?
Well, it's interesting that this even came up for a vote because always in the past few years, the legislative leadership has been able to keep bills off the floor that had the potential to be amended in the gut and go way that this one was. And, you know, Democrats used to hate gut and go, but you know, like the governor said, you
Several
know,
debaters pulled that, made that point.
That's very true.
yeah, so it's there's some bipartisanship there on the support of gut and go. But so how did, you know, from a political standpoint of maneuvering, how did this happen? And now that this bill goes over to the Senate, will President Wagle attempt to keep this bill off the floor too? Personally, I'm of the mind that if one house passes a bill, the other house needs to consider it, just out of courtesy, if nothing else. But Susan Wagle's very opposed to that, so we'll have to see if she can keep that off the floor.
Well, and she certainly made a issue this term of being opposed to the governor as well, so we'll have to see. Now, the governor has said she really doesn't like a bill that would let you itemize your tax deductions here in Kansas again because of a corporate tax change it involves. It's headed to her desk, though, so I asked her, will she veto it? SB 22 is headed your way. It's been highly controversial. You have come out very strongly against it. Are you going to veto that bill?
You know, I have consistently said that until I actually see a bill, I never showed my hands on how I was going to vote, and I won't do that on this either.
Now, one thing that the House added to this bill was a 1% cut in grocery sales tax, which is something that you have supported before, is cutting the grocery sales tax. We have one of the highest in the region. Even if that goes through and you decide to sign this bill, that still leaves us at, what is it, 5.5%? Is there a way, can you see a way to bring that down further?
Well, I think, you know, as with everything else, we need to let the dust settle so we recognize the full impact of what we did in 2017 on state level to our tax structure, what the feds did. When we have a better idea, you know, then we can start to figure out a path towards really balancing out our taxes. You know, the thing that really worked for Kansas was that old three-legged stool, you know, sort of an equal amount: property tax, income tax, sales tax. And we need to get back to that balance. My first target, though, would be the sales tax on food, because we're not just almost the highest, we are the highest in the country on food sales tax. So that would be the first target.
Now, one thing I wanted to point out there is, well, it seemed like a very political answer when she said, I don't want to discuss. I want to give her the credit that as I covered her in the Senate, if I tried to talk to her about how she was going to vote on a bill, she wouldn't discuss it until the debate came up. So that is kind of a standing tradition with her. I will give her that. That said, she's the governor. I want to know if she's going to veto the damn thing.
I mean, again, you know, several different things that we could say. I am actually vaguely suspicious that if the rehonorization argument had gone differently, she might have thought differently about this bill, because, you know, there would have been a little bit more money for her to play around with. There, you know, some of the things that she's looking at long term might have looked a little bit different. But that being said, you know, she has insisted all along that we still have not actually, you know, finalized, you know, the consequences of the Brownback tax experiment. There are still things that we don't know. In the wake of this, you have changes in federal tax law that could potentially put a certain amount of money on the table, but we really don't know how much that's going to be. And so she's, you know, tried to portray herself as a fiscal conservative in these matters, which is interesting because, you know, technically, here's a bill that would allow for a cut in the food tax, which nobody likes. But she's, you know, probably going to feel obliged to veto this simply because, you know, it would put in too many additional wrinkles in the things that she has already moving forward in the legislature.
And Adam, grocery sales tax, everybody I've ever talked to, they want it gone.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
Hugely unpopular.
You know, and wouldn't she like to be able to say that? You know, but I think she's going to veto it, and that's going to be used against her.
All right.
Well, the grocery sales tax, it's a lot of money that would be very difficult to make up for if we were to cut the sales tax on food much further. But it is very regressive on lower income households, would spend a higher proportion of their income on food than do upper income households, and it's tougher for them.
All right. Well, we've got one other thing to talk about, and SB 22 is a prime example of it. We've seen Senator Wagle and the governor going after it. Another key theme of the governor's campaign was her ability to work across the aisle. Now, there have been mixed reviews from Republicans on whether she's managed that, especially as she's gone head-to-head with Senate President Susan Wagle. So what does Governor Kelly think of the complaints that she's become too aloof? What do you think has been a bigger stumbling block for the state? Dealing with the budget or trying to work with the split in the parties between the governor's office and the legislature?
Well, I think there's a lot of grandstanding that's been going on. You have to expect that. This is a political process. It's a political environment, so nothing that's happened has really been of concern to me or particularly a surprise. I sort of expect leadership to do those kinds of things. But, we also have a lot of rank and file folks who are the ones, working on a day-to-day basis to get things done. And so I've been meeting with both leadership and rank and file legislators from both sides of the aisle, and we are working towards the process of, negotiating, compromising, and coming to common ground.
Now, certainly what you would expect her to say, that she made a promise of working across the aisle, and that's happening even if leadership isn't working with her. And I've got to say, as somebody who was in the market and watching during Kathleen Sebelius' governorship, I don't find any of this too surprising. Do you, Adam?
Not really, no. I mean, there's just always been that kind of divide. I mean, the Republicans have the majority of the government, and the fact that they don't have the governorship, it's, it's kind of a sticking point, and they want to have their say, and, But then in the end, though, there's still only one governor, and people need to remember that.
Hey, Bob, what about you?
Well, I know Russell disagreed with me this one time, I think, but yes, there are a big majority of Republicans in both chambers of the legislature, but many of these Republicans are, I don't want to say Democrats in disguise, but they have Democratic leanings, and we saw word there just recently 3 defections from the Republican Party to the Democrats. So sometimes groups like Kansas Policy Institute and others that rank legislators on how they vote, you'll have Republicans way down at the bottom of a list, and now from Kansas Policy Institute, that means they're not voting in a conservative way. You can turn that over from other groups like the Mainstream Coalition, and those same Republicans end up with a much more liberal voting record. So just evidence of this, I think, is that the governor got what she wanted with the Medicaid expansion.
No. And certainly not a surprise that she knows how to work the system. I mean, she spent 14 years in the Senate, Russell.
And the system has been in place for decades. Moderate Republicans versus conservative Republicans, or maybe true Republicans versus fake Republicans, however you want to define them.
I don't think we're going to solve that debate today.
That's been a truism about Kansas politics long before Kelly, long before Sebelius. So of course she's going to make use of the divide. She got 28 Republicans, more than a third of the Republican caucus in the House, to vote against their own leadership. She has to count on those sorts of things.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see how the rest of her term in office goes. Adam, Russell, Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I don't know when we'll get the chance to interview the governor again, but she and the lieutenant governor have an open invitation to join me here on Kansas Week. If they do, what questions would you like to get answers to? Let us know on social media. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV. For now, have a great week.